Hi, today we're going to take a look at the podcast app Scast. The goal for this project has been to provide a hassle-free way for you to manage your podcast collection. So without further ado, let's start by taking a look at the app itself. Once you have entered the app, you will be presented with the 12 most popular podcasts available right now. If you don't find something you like, you can of course use the search functionality to look for something that you already know you find interesting. So let's check out a BBC podcast. Here we can check out the In Our Time podcast by BBC Radio 4. Once we've entered the podcast site, we will be able to see all the episodes that I have released, and we can of course see previous released episodes if one so desires. Of course we can play a podcast that we find interesting, so let's pick this one.
This is the BBC.
Thanks for downloading this episode of it.
Franklin followed, and it is what scientist was working with him and for him, and that each other. And I imagine, as is typically was his ensued over the next few years.
And
that is the basic functionality of the media player. Of course, a podcast app wouldn't be complete without the ability to subscribe to your favorite podcast. So let's go to the subscription section. Once at the subscription section, the user will be prompted to sign up for an account. So let's do that. Once we've signed up, we can log in with our newly registered account. Of course, since we're using an empty account, we won't have any subscriptions saved to our account. So let's fix that. Let's go to the homepage and add some of the popular podcasts. And we can of course add that BBC podcast we listened to earlier. Once saved, we can look at our subscriptions in our subscription box, and we can delete the ones that we don't find interesting. This can of course also be done directly in the homepage. If the user leaves the app and comes back later, it can pick up right where it left. This is possible since Scast saves your playback information locally on your device. Before we dive into the actual code, I would like to talk a little bit about the biggest problem I've encountered during the development of this project. And that is the fact that there aren't really any centralized way of finding all of the podcasts. Because podcasts are basically just RSS feeds that contains links and information to the episodes. But to actually find the feeds are a much bigger problem. I've chosen to solve this by utilizing the Apple Search API. And by doing this, I'm able to offer all the same podcasts that Apple does in their podcast app. The app itself talks directly to the Search API in some instances. For example, when it finds the popular podcast and when it's doing the actual searching. But to handle your subscriptions, your episode listing, and login credentials, we're using the backend. And of course, all of this will be covered in more detail once we're actually looking at the code. So let's start to look at the actual app. Here we have the main file, and this is where we actually create our application. So I have created a Vue instance that I will use as an event hub, which basically allows me to send information to and from components. I will add that as a mix-in, which means that all the components will be able to utilize it. And I also have a user object, which contains all the user-related data, for example, if the user is logged in or not. And the last thing we do is to create our actual Vue instance that will contain our router and we will actually render our app. So if we take a look in the app file, this is the main wrapper for the application, which contains the navigation bar here at the top. It also contains our router view, that is the view that would change for each route. And we have our media player placed at the bottom, and that is a separate component as well. The methods for this file is basically just a pair of router pushes, that is that we're able to navigate, so we can search and we can go to our subscriptions and so forth. If we take a look at the user object, which is the main global state that handles all user-related data, it contains a state of whether or not the user is signed in, and we have a list of subscriptions. And since this app relies very heavily on the Apple Search API to know where we can find a podcast, I only save the collection ID, which is the unique identifier that Apple uses to identify podcasts. So this list would basically just be filled with a large set of numbers that symbolizes all of those unique IDs. If we take a look at the methods, we have some sign in and sign out related methods. And further down, we are able to fetch up subscriptions and also add and delete them. And lastly, we have our sign up method. If we take a look at actual components, we can start with artist card, and I will show you a little picture right here of how it looks like. This is the card that will be shown within the episode list that you saw before. So it basically just contains the collection name, which is the name of the podcast, and the artist name, as well as the artwork. The episode list contains the list of episodes. So here we see the play button, the episode title, as well as the duration. It will initially load 10 entities, but you can choose to load more by pressing the load more button at the bottom in order to increase that count by 10 each time you press it. By pressing the play button, we will utilize that event bus we talked about before in order to send an event to our media player, which will start to play the episode that we pass to it. We also have some basic formatting functions because the duration doesn't look the same for every podcast. The feed component is probably the most used component in the whole app. It's used to present a popular podcast, it presents the search result as well as your subscriptions. And it basically contains a set of cards which represent each podcast. And if you're signed in, you will be able to see the add or delete subscription button. When it comes to the functionality for this component, it pretty much only contains the add and delete subscription as well as the show episode that will basically just jump to the view that contains the episode list. If we take a look at the media player, on the other hand, we have a lot more functionality. The media player presents all the information about the current episode. That is the duration. We will show the episode image if it has one. If it hasn't, we will use a placeholder instead, as well as the title and the name of the author. And then to accompany that, we have the duration and our playback controls, which is our play and rewind and forward. We also have some styles to go with that, and we can skip that for now. And here we come to the actual data set. We will have the current playing episode, the current time, that is the time that our media player that we have created down here is currently at. We have our total duration for the episode. And we have states to know if it's playing or loading in order to either show the play or pause button, or if we're going to disable the controls and show a buffering icon instead. The last saved time basically keeps track of how often we're saving the current time to a local storage in order to continue from the same point we left off. This is used so we don't save too often. We have our play pause that will basically just tell the player to play pause. We have the skip functionality. The C functionality is based around a percentage that we are tapping on the progress bar. We have some more formatting, very similar to the one we saw before. We've set up a watch for the episode, which means that the player would respond once we have exchanged that current playing episode and reload the new data instead. And once we're creating the component, we will set up the event bus to listen to the play episode event and also configure the player. And also we will hook up some event listeners in order to keep track of all our states. If we take a look at the mounted method, this is where we're setting up the seek bar hit detector so we can seek back and forward during the clip. And also we will get the data from local storage to see if we have a previously recorded episode so we can continue from where we left off. The spinner component is basically just that, a simple spinner that we're showing when we're loading content. And the reason why it's a separate component is just so we don't have to retype all of this every time we want a spinner. Okay, so let's take a look at actual views. The views is what's holding the actual components that we looked at before. So in this example, we're looking at the episodes view, which contains the artist card that will show what podcast we're currently browsing, as well as the episode list that will contain all of the episodes. And if we're currently loading data, we will show a loading spinner instead. If we look at actual code, we will have a data set of all the episodes that will later on pass down to our components, because it's always the Vue's job to gather that data. The components aren't aware of how to fetch data. They only get the data that the Vue serves them. And we also keep track of our artist, that is the author of the actual podcast. And we keep tracking if we're loading data or not. The prop that can get passed, this is a variable that other views, or in this case, it's actually the router that passes the collection ID. And this is the variable that you will see in the address bar that contains the collection ID for the current podcast that we're listing episodes for. Once the view is mounted, we will get the episodes and as well as the author. And the get episode basically just sends out a request to our backend to get the episodes for this collection ID. And the response that we get back will be JSON encoded instead of the XML one that is used in the RSS feed. And when we're calling get artist, we are making a lookup directly to the Apple Search API. And it basically contains the feed component that is getting past the popular podcast list that we are getting from down here. And it will show a spinner if we are loading. So if we take a look at the actual data it contains, it will have the list of the popular podcast as well as the loading state. And down here, we will see in the method, it only contains one method, which is talking directly to the iTunes Search API, and it will get the most popular podcasts from there. We also have a page not found view that will be shown if we're entering an address that the app cannot resolve. If we take a look at the search view, it will visually look very similar to the home page. The difference is that we will actually search for podcast and give that to the feed instead of the popular podcast list. So the dataset looks similar, but we will instead pass a prop, and this is the search term that will be passed as a URL parameter to the search view, which contains our actual search term. The actual search is once again done directly towards Apple because our backend doesn't and cannot really keep track on where to find those RSS feeds. So there is no need to go through the backend in order to call Apple from there. So we can just talk to that API directly. And we will also set the loading and our results based on the response we're getting. The sign-in view contains our actual sign-in form. And before we are entering our view, we actually check if we are already signed in, and if we are being redirected directly to our subscriptions instead. The dataset keeps track on if we're actually loading something, that is if we're trying to sign in, and also what username and password we have provided. When it comes to methods, we are using the sign-in method that will basically make a call to the user's sign-in method that we looked at before. And if it's a success, we will go to our subscription page. And if it wasn't, we will prompt the user that it provided the wrong username or password. We can also go to our sign-up page, and it will simply just make a push to the sign-up view instead. And the sign-up view is quite similar to the sign-in view. It basically just contains our email, password, and confirm password boxes. And if we take a look at the methods, we will do a similar check to the one we did in sign-in form. And the data set is quite similar as well. Before we're actually signing up, we're doing some basic checks on the front-end side in order to not throw away data that we already know is wrong to the backend. And then later on, we will use the sign-up function from the user object that will actually send the data to the backend where it will do its final validation. And if we have signed up correctly, we will go to the sign-in page, and if not, we will prompt the user to check its credentials. And it also contains a method to go to the sign-in page and a simplified way of showing that toast. The subscription view also looks very similar to the home page. It has a feed, but this time it will be fed your subscriptions instead of the popular podcast. So the first thing we do is, before we actually enter the view, we will see if we're signed in. And if we aren't, we will go to the sign-in page instead. The data is our current subscriptions, and we have to keep track on if we're loading or not. When it comes to methods, we only have one, which is to get my actual subscriptions. And what we're doing here is we're trying to get the actual subscription data, because as I told you before, we are only keeping track of the IDs. When it comes to methods, we basically only have one, which is to retrieve our subscriptions. And here we are converting those collection IDs to actual user presentable data. And this is done by asking Apple for the latest information that it got on that collection. And we will then add it to our collection list and present it to the user. We also have a watch on the user subscription list. And this means that if we're, for example, deleting something, we will only remove it from the subscriptions list. But by watching it, we're able to remove it once we're calling get my subscriptions. So we won't refetch anything that we already know, but we will delete or add the things that has been either added or deleted. And the first thing we're doing when we are mounting the view is, of course, getting our subscriptions. The router itself pretty much only contains routes to all the views that we just looked at. So we have the home, search, episode, and so forth. And we're also mapping the wildcard that hasn't been matched to the page not found component. And that is basically it for the front-end side. So now we're going to take a look at the backend instead. The backend is written in Go. So let's start from the beginning. The first thing we're trying to do is to initialize an empty database. And if we already have one, we won't initialize it. And if that fails, we will close our program because we can't continue without that one. And then I'm using Gin and Gonic to handle our actual routing. We are using a cross-origins middleware in order to handle course requests. And we're also using an authentication middleware that means that we can't access or delete or add. That means that we can list, add, or delete anything from our subscription list without being properly authenticated. And then for the open path, we're able to list episodes for any collection, and we can sign in and register. The episode handler is what actually gets the episode list for the client. So what it does is that it takes a collection ID, it asks Apple for the RSS link, and then we are gathering that RSS feed and we're parsing it into JSON. So the client can work with JSON-based data instead of the XML-based one that the RSS feed contains. If we're looking at the sign-in handler, it will take a user combination. We will check if that user combination exists. And if the user combo exists, we will generate a token for the user and send a success. Otherwise, it will be unauthorized and it will have to try again. The register handler first do some basic checks regarding the formatting, if we have the correct password length and if the email seems to be an email. And otherwise, we try to add a user. And if that fails, it probably tells us that the user already exists. Otherwise, it's a success. The get subscription handler is basically just returning the list of all of your episodes. So it's a list of all of those collection IDs that you have. And this requires you to be authenticated to access. The same thing goes for subscribe to collection, which means that we will get the collection ID for your subscription. And we will get the username from your token. And then we will insert it into the database together with your username. The unsubscribe handler pretty much does the reverse thing. So we will get the collection ID and your username, and then we will delete that from the database. And then we have our cross-origins middleware as well as the authentication middleware right here that will either tell us to continue if you have a valid token, and if you don't, we will abort and say that it's unauthorized. Here we have the actual functions that the main file used. So we have our actual database set up, so we will see if it contains our two tables, subscriptions and users. And if it doesn't, we will load our database schema and we will insert those tables. Okay, so now we're looking at a file that contains the actual functions for the main file that we looked at before. So we have our setup database right here. And the first thing it does is that it checks whether or not we're actually having the subscriptions and user tables already. And if it doesn't, we will go and load up our schema and we will add those tables to the database. And if everything goes as expected, we will return no error and we're good to go. The generate token method does what the name suggests. It generates a JSON web token that contains your username as well as sets issued and expiration date that will be 1 year ahead in the future. And then we are generating that based off the keys that we have saved on disk. The parse RSA private key is basically just a simplified method for our key parsing. So that is utilized up here in the generate token section right here, where we read the PEM file. The add user is basically just an insert statement for inserting our username, hash, and salt into the database once we are registering a new user. And if we look down here, we have the generate salt that is utilized when we're inserting a new user. And the user comeback is basically just checks if we have data in the database that matches the credentials that the user provided. And we have a simplified way to get a byte array for our SHA-3 that's used when we are both registering and signing in. We have a similar simplified method for parsing an RSA public key. And here we have the actual token validation that will parse our JSON web token. And we will check whether or not we actually are the ones that created it to begin with. And if we are, we of course let the user know that they are free to use those authentication protected routes. Here we're just basically extracting the username from the token, and we're able to get our subscriptions by the get subscription method, which is basically just selecting all of the collection IDs from our subscriptions and returning them as an array that is later returned as a JSON array to the user. Then we have a subscribe to collection function that is inserting our collection ID with the corresponding username. And we're of course also able to unsubscribe from a collection by running a delete statement on it. Last but not least, we have a couple of structs that is basically just used for binding our JSON data to actual structures within Go. And that's about it for this project. So thank you for listening.